Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back, everybody. So here we are, bracing for change, a week and change away from the elections. And you hear it all the time. People talking about the polls. And the polls, we have, this candidate ahead of that one. What are these polls? How is this derived? Is it accurate? It's, of course, premature at this point, but a lot of times those polls are out there and a lot of people take it as it is the end all. We're going to look at that today through the eyes of somebody who will apply science to give us a better look at it. And this is a gentleman that has had many discoveries in many different areas over decades, and it's so wonderful to have him back with us. Grant Venerable is our Professional of the Year and joins us once again. Hi, Grant. How are you doing today?
Hello, Stephen. I'm fine.
This is something we skimmed the polling topic, but I would say about a couple of months ago, but so topical now in terms of the elections coming up. And then there's a lot of other things that come into play, race just being one of them. What's your look? Here we are, a week or so away from the elections and the polls. What's your thoughts from what you're hearing?
Well, my first thought to share is the limitations of a poll, and that there's two kinds. The news media rather glosses over that, and that adds to the confusion. There's something called a balloting poll. That doesn't occur until people mail in ballots or appear in a voting booth to place their ballot in the pool of ballots, and that's one kind. The certainty around the results of that balloting poll is very, very high, and it depends on the efficacy of all of the players in the process. And the better they are, the greater the certainty is of the results. And that's been pretty accurate in the United States for some years. They're not perfect, and that's one of the first rules of science, is that no process is perfect, whether it's a thermodynamic process. In fact, that's called the second law of thermodynamics. And then there's human-made processes. They cannot be 100% accurate or perfect. What we live in is an imperfect world, but we depend on the purity of the systems that we're trying to test. Same thing with polling. It can be done with a very high degree of accuracy, but is it? And it dawned on me about 1 week ago what the greatest weakness is in the survey poll, which is different from the ballot poll. The survey poll depends upon contacting people through the mail, through the text message, or through a telephone call, and to ask the taker a question. And it occurred to me the greatest weakness in the survey poll is the veracity of the speaker's response. How do you know that they're telling you the truth? You can't. You cannot know. And there's a big example of that in 1982 when Mayor Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles, ran for governor. It was a very great contest, a lot of attention on it, a lot of survey polling was done, and it predicted a victory for Bradley. But when the ballot survey occurred, Bradley lost by significant points. And then the news media had to really look at that. What happened? Well, what happened is that not everyone was honest, in their answer to the question, who are you voting for? That introduces another factor. In the United States, it's against the law to compel anyone to tell you who they plan to vote for or who they voted for, because central to our system of democracy is the secret ballot. And I do not divulge who I'm voting for except to my closest friends. So that makes me really a failure as far as poll takers, who are you voting for? I either don't respond, but I don't lie, but I just simply don't respond. I said, it's none of your business. I live in a democracy, and we have the secret ballot. So that's an interesting point also. But recent polling has focused on a particular demographic called the black male. And more recent times, the young black male, that there is a trend toward their voting for one of the party candidates and not for the other, which has been more the turf for that demographic to vote for. So that's difficult because, again, who is the black male? It depends on how you define the black male. That is a real sticking point in America. It hits the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled recently on an affirmative action case, and they have outlawed affirmative action. They don't want to see any actions based upon the race of the person involved. Now that brings up the other side of the question. What is race? And I checked with my notes. I was reviewing my notes from teaching at San Francisco State back in the 1990s. And my notes of 1996 had refined a whole list of definitions sociologically in American society. And one of those most elusive definitions, which everyone thinks is a slam dunk, but it isn't. If it were a slam dunk, we would not have any race problems today. End of quote. End of statement. But we have enormous race problems. The basis of it is nobody knows what in the heck race is. And when you ask someone, well, what are you? And that's what has been the bugaboo in college admissions. I figured that out after I read enough cases like the recent one with Harper being taken to court for discriminating against members of the Chinese race. But is Chinese race a race? Oh, that gets complex as well. And anyway, that led to other things. So how do you define race? Well, there's what we call the definitions and functions of race in scholarship. Academic scholarship is concerned not just with the definitions, but the functions of something. Let's start with the function of race. The function of race is power. It's political power. And it may involve corporate power, administrative power, but race is the core function of that, speaking in a social, psychological way. Now, if you break that down, you go to the definitions of race, and you get an idea of how that is. So if you start with the general misconception people have used way back to the early 20th century, people would probe for your so-called race and say, oh, well, what is your nationality? So nationality has been part of the conflation of race with something other than race. Well, nationality is not race. It never has been race. I had a very clear case of that with one of my students. And there were about 50 students in the class, that particular class meeting. We were sitting in a circle so that we could participate in the conversation. Now, we're going to play race definition and identification with each other. So I'd point to each student in turn and ask the class so that I could write on the blackboard what the responses were. And I had the basic definitions on the board. And one of them was nationality. I pointed to this young gentleman and asked the class, what is his nationality? Well, people assumed he was American, but that was incorrect. And so we had to ask him, because you can't tell looking at someone what their nationality is. If you heard them speak, that might be a clue. So he said His nationality is Senegalese. He was born and raised in Senegal. But did he look anything like what we think a Senegalese looks like? No. That gets into race defined by phenotype. Your phenomenal type, the appearance, how you sound. Well, he looked like a garden variety white American who might have been born in Southern Europe. And that was his phenotype. He looked that way. But so the phenotype is what you see physically. So we got to another category. Well, what is his religion? Well, you don't know unless you see some kind of accoutrement that the person is wearing, that's religious, a symbol. But nobody could say what his religion is because you had to ask. So he said his religion is Islam. He's a Muslim. Oh, then we get into ethnicity, ethnic culture. Well, what is your ethnic culture? Can you tell? No, the class couldn't tell. Once you find he's Senegalese, that doesn't really tell you the ethnicity or the culture. So it turns out, well, he generally described himself as culturally African. Then we get to another category. Well, if race is defined as your regional gene pool, where you descended from, like 100 years ago or 500 years ago, we couldn't tell that. So we had to ask him. He came from a more Arabic and combined blended African gene pool. Well, that's just an example of how conflated and confusing race can get. So where do people stop? They stop with what the eyes see. And I wondered how the Supreme Court could never get to the bottom or the root of that question. And so they ruled on incomplete considerations of race, its definitions, and its functions. They kind of played around with the functions, but the definitions came down to, they didn't say this, but they kind of walked around the bush about it. And I realized the universities are collecting data on race for the most part, not by requesting photographs of the applicants, but by asking the applicant or the parent of the applicant, what race do you consider yourself? And I said, that has to be it. That's the point of confusion. It's why race has been so confusing and led to so much problem. Because they're asking, in this case, people to describe their own race. And in most cases, 99.99%, they don't know. And if they look like something that they're not classified as, that adds more complexity to it. And that's very common, of misidentification of someone defined as black who looks white, or someone defined as white who looks more black or something else. So it gets to the ultimate conundrum of race, is that white turns out to be anything that's not black, or anything that has no color in the skin, or very minimal melanin in the skin. How are we doing so far, Stephen? Are we clicking here?
I am blown away how this has been going on for forever. And to your point, many people don't even know what race they are. They assume, but they're not 100% sure. And now, take a look at the media trying to dissect that and figure that all out. Amazing.
No. Have you heard of the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924?
No, I haven't.
I am guessing, it's a good guess, that the Supreme Court relies on that without really admitting it. But it defines anyone who's white as who is not more than 1/64th African in origin. You let that sink in.
Say that, Grant, say that one more time. Need to process that.
You are at least 1/64th African in your genetic heritage. You get by, you can be white. But if you're greater than 1/64th, you have to be black or something else, not white.
Well, if you were to look at a DNA test such as Ancestry.com, I'm actually, according to that, 1% or maybe a little bit more black. That's what it says.
Well, that's what's, look at the Henry Louis Gates, Finding Your Roots. That's been the most amazing and powerful show on television, where we've found so many people that have so many gene pools they didn't know they belonged to. And,
wow.
And there was such history. So my family is no exception to that. So I've done a lot of that genetic work for my family. But that's really where we're going here, and how the polls can get so unreliable. So we won't know who wins the presidential election until sometime after next Tuesday. The survey polls are really no good. It's minimal what you can get from that.
So,
and the reason that it's so minimal is that it's this factor. You don't know if your pool of a sample respondents is telling you the truth, who they're voting for. And I would suspect, as with the Tom Bradley case in 1982, we don't know any better in 2024 than we knew then.
That being said, what's your personal opinion of the elections and the polling process itself?
It's misleading.
Okay.
And that's what the news media really needs to get clear. They get so enthralled with the mathematical algorithms that they use, and they can say how wonderful it is, and this poll has been wrong over only once in 50 years and all that. They're too impressed with their own intellects, which are actually limited because they haven't studied enough physics and mathematics or biology.
I might have shared with you in the past on how media ratings are done, but to your point, back in the day, and it changed around 2007, 2008 in that territory, where it went electronic, and I'll explain that in a second. But I believe the methodology is pretty solid. But prior to that time, media companies, Nielsen, and there's other ones, would solicit to get a random sampling of the audience, and then would ask you, what radio station did you listen to? People would take a pen and just write down on a quote-unquote diary and then send it back. And you're compensated, $20, whatever it might be. To your point, people would just write down whatever their default station was, whatever the big station in town was. It wasn't really accurate until they changed it, where now people physically wear a box, sort of like an old school pager. It listens to what you listen to. So it knows without doubt what radio station you're listening to. And you could walk into a deli. You could get in an Uber, and there's music being played, through the radio. That will count. So to me, that's a definitive answer as to, there's no question. The only sticky point here, how do you define a random sampling of the audience? You could be in a metro area of 2.5 million people, and the random sampling is 1,200 people out of 2.5 million. How do you figure that out? That's, to me, it seems, Grant, there's always gray territory in all of this. Would you feel the same?
Was that a question?
Yeah. Just, any of the, election process, the polls, there's always a gray territory, no matter what.
That's right. That's the uncertainty principle of quantum physics.
Exactly.
Applied at the social level, which is surprisingly similar to the quantum electronic subatomic particle level.
All right.
It's hard for...
You just went over my head right there.
It's hard for social scientists to get their arms around that because they haven't studied quantum physics.
Amazing.
And they can't get past their own biases, which say, well, people are not atoms and electrons, and subatomic particles. Therefore, we cannot rely on the principles that govern the subatomic world to understand the social world. But it's getting out there. There's plenty of quantum physicists who bother to look will tell you about that. And
what's your feeling? And we just passed the weekend where people were early voting. I have a number of friends that stood online for half hour, 45 minutes to vote early. Your overall thoughts on that? Effective, not effective, waste of time? What are your thoughts?
Early voting?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a delight. Here in Georgia, we're permitted to early vote if we're elderly. And I think that means above 60 or something like that. And I went in, I hand-delivered my vote to make sure it got into the right hands. And there were lines, but there was also an air of joy in the atmosphere of people coming in to hand-deliver their ballots. And I enjoy that. So that really reflects my view about that. The more there's human contact and people rubbing up against each other in close concert, that brings out the human joys.
You know, I guess we should brace ourselves because we're probably going to hear early results show insert name of candidate ahead. Let's just wait. We're just waiting for that. We're waiting for that news update.
Right. Well, it's patience time.
Yeah. Just tap the brakes and
learning patience and get out of your intellectual brain and just live in the moment.
Wow. Fascinating talking with you. It really is. And definitely so different in hearing this through the eyes of a scientist, somebody that looks at it in a different way. And oh my gosh, I believe you open our eyes when it comes to race and somebody's background, whereby many of us don't even know what we are. And by the way, back to that ancestry test, I took one last year and found out that I am Lithuanian. I had no idea I was Lithuanian.
Yes.
I also found out I have a half sister who is black, and we met over the summer. And
oh my goodness,
wonderful! And by the way, guess where she lives? Outside of Atlanta.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And I don't even know. My father passed when I was 21, and my half sister is 15 years younger. I don't even know if my dad knew. I don't even know if he knew. We'll never know. But I found it. Now I have a new family member, and it's amazing when you look at it that way.
That's beautiful. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Thank you. Grant, thank you for today. Appreciate all the insight, and looking forward next time we get together.
You're welcome, Stephen.
All the best. We'll be right back. Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.